Welcome everyone to the Cultivating Compassion Education Series, sponsored by Compassionate Care ALS. We're honored today to have with us Dr. Richard Bedlack, who's going to speak about hope in ALS and things he's learned. Dr. Bedlack is he's the Stewart, Hughes, and Wendt Distinguished Professor of ALS and leader of the ALS program at Duke University. He received his MD and PhD in neuroscience from the University of Connecticut, then went to Duke for his medical internship, Neurology Residency, and Neuromuscular Fellowship. Since 2001, he has been working in partnership with patients to create new options for living a better and longer life with ALS, to empower people living with ALS to be more effective research partners via the ALS Clinical Research Learning Institute, to help patients and families make more informed decisions about alternative and off-label treatments via the ALSUntangled program, and to better understand ALS reversals and try to make them happen more often. He has published over 160 papers and has received numerous awards for his patient care, research, teaching, and advocacy. He lives in North Carolina with his wife, Shelley, a closet full of eye-catching blazers, and two mischievous cats. Welcome, Dr. Bedlack. Before we get started, I'd like to turn it over to our founder, Ron Hoffman, to say a few words. Welcome, Ron.
Thanks, James. Richard, thank you so much for being here. Most importantly, thank everybody who's on the call for being here. I know sometimes it's not easy. I see a lot of the families that we work with across the country and a lot of new faces. So again, thank you. I met Dr. Bedlack some years ago, and actually many years ago, but we never really met. I kind of observed him from afar, started learning about the work that he does. And what I truly appreciate about not just the research and the work that he does and the intricacies of it, but most importantly for me, I appreciate how he literally shows up for those people living with ALS that he serves. That quality of presence and of deep listening. To me, there's nothing more important than that. And his ability to answer questions and to stay in touch with his people, his patients, his clients. So that's what I hold really dear and have huge appreciation for, Richard, you and your ways. So without that, everybody, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Bedlack. Thank you, Richard.
Well, thank you so much, James and Ron, for that kind introduction. And I just have to say, I'm a huge fan of Compassionate Care ALS and the work that you do. And I'm looking forward to working more closely together this summer. Yeah, so as you heard, I'm going to talk today about a topic that surprisingly, I've never heard anyone else talk about in 23 years of doing this, and that's hope in ALS. And really, it's been a multi-year project for me to read about this and try to come to some level of understanding. And I have to say, as in the title, there's still some things that I don't know about that I want to learn about. So I do have some disclosures. You can read these carefully later if you want, but I don't think any of them are relevant for this talk. I'll tell you today how I came to appreciate the importance of hope in ALS. I'll tell you about the literature review that I did looking at hope in health and hope in chronic diseases other than ALS. And that will include what I think is the best definition and ways to measure hope, the evidence that it matters, and the possible explanation, and then sources of hope and challenges to providing it. And then we'll turn our attention to the literature review that I did on hope specifically in ALS. And you'll see that, unfortunately, there's not nearly as much literature. But we'll talk about how that literature defines hope and the evidence that's there that it matters. And then finally, I'll tell you how I've put all this into practice now and what my next steps are. So I never really had an ALS mentor. I started the program at Duke University around the year 2001. And there wasn't anybody at Duke that was doing ALS before me. Duke didn't really have any patients. There wasn't anybody that was particularly interested in ALS. And so the way I was learning about it was reading everything I could get my hands on and traveling around the world to meet with the experts who were doing this. And what I was really learning was the science of ALS, like why we thought it was happening, what sorts of things we were supposed to be measuring, at what measurement levels did we offer different evidence and experience-based options. And then I had an experience in clinic that really changed me. And so I remember walking into this room one day and three things struck me. First, the person that was sitting in a wheelchair that was to become my patient was the youngest person I'd ever seen with ALS. They were just a little over 20 years old. Second, I had never seen this many people in one exam room before. There had to be at least 15 people in there. And third, this was the wildest bunch of folks that I'd ever run across. I mean, they were even more wildly dressed than I was. They had mohawks and piercings and lots of tattoos. And after we finished talking about the disease and what sorts of things I had to offer, I asked the question about the tattoos because I couldn't help but notice that most of the people in the room had a tattoo of a black swallow. In fact, the patient had an entire sleeve of black swallow tattoos. And he said, I didn't really know my mom. She passed away when I was real little, but she left me a book, and on every page, she drew a picture of a black swallow. And I don't know why, but when I got to be old enough to get a tattoo, I got every swallow from that book tattooed on my arm. And then when I started to get sick, everyone I knew got one of these swallows tattooed somewhere on their body to show that we're in this together. And we call ourselves the Often Awesome Army. And we're going to keep this positive and hopeful. And unbelievably, they did. Every single time they came as an army with this patient. And they started off every visit on such a positive note with a funny story or some amazing fundraiser that they had. And they buoyed that young man through a very difficult course with his ALS. And he stayed very positive and hopeful in spite of the disabilities and challenges that he had. And toward the end of his life, I said, I'm so impressed by what I've seen that I would like to be part of this army. And so I got one of these swallows tattooed on my wrist. And I got it on my left wrist because it used to be the last thing I would do is sign a person's chart. And it popped out. And it reminded me that not everyone has an Often Awesome Army. Sometimes I got to be that army. And so it's stuck with me, and it's made me think about how I can offer hope to people with this disease when they don't have their own Often Awesome Army. And so to try to understand this a little bit better, I've done a literature review. And I have to tell you, it's been a massive undertaking. This is a huge topic. If you look up hope and health, there's 36,000 scientific publications. Hope and disease, 34,000, most of which come from the cancer literature. Unfortunately, when you look up hope and ALS, there's only about 279 publications, so it's far less well studied. So let's talk a little bit about this literature review in health and chronic diseases other than ALS. So first, we got to figure out how to define this. And I have to say, there must be at least 25 different definitions of hope in this literature. But these are the ones that I like the best. It's optimism combined with the belief that one has the agency to make things better. It's a state of positive motivation that's based on three things: objectives and goals, routes for achieving these goals, and motivation toward achieving these goals. There's more than 30 different reliable and validated instruments that are in use in this literature to measure hope. Two of the ones that I most commonly came across are the Hearth Hope Index, HHI. That's shown on this slide. That's 12 questions. Each is scored by the patient from 0 to 4, where 4 means that you're doing better, with the exception of questions 3 and 4, which are inverted. And so the best you could do on this would be a 48, and the worst you could do would be a 0. And then there's also the State Hope Scale. That's 6 questions. Each question is scored from 1 to 8, where 1 is that's definitely false, and 8 is that's definitely true, and there's all kinds of iterations in between. The thing about these instruments is they can tell you whether there's hope or not, and maybe even how much hope, but there's some subtleties that they can't tell you about. So first of all, the literature talks about dispositional hope, which means it's there at baseline. Nothing has to be done to bring it out. And then there's augmented hope, which is brought on by a targeted intervention. Hopes are often individualized. Not everyone has the same exact hope in the course of a disease. And so in this one study I saw that looked at patients with far advanced cancer, some of the different things they were hopeful about were to maintain quality of life, to maintain preservation of function, to achieve some milestone like going to someone's graduation or wedding, to achieve stabilization, and of course, to achieve a cure. The final subtlety is what people refer to as true and false hope, where the literature says true hope is that's grounded in reality, and false hope assumes a distorted reality. And it turns out that physicians are under the impression that there's a lot more false hope in different communities of patients than is really the case. We'll talk more about that. So why is hope important? Well, there's a whole bunch of association studies. And some of these studies were done in healthy people, people without any kind of chronic disease. And there you can see that these dispositional hope scores nicely correlate with quality of life, pain perception, and reductions in a lot of different future diseases, including depression, anxiety, hypertension, diabetes, respiratory tract infections, cancer, insomnia, number of chronic conditions, and even all-cause mortality. And given the size of this literature, it made me scratch my head and wonder, how come I never had a class in how to be hopeful when I was growing up? There's also association studies that are done in people with chronic diseases other than ALS. Again, most of these are done in cancer, but these studies clearly show an association between hope scores and quality of life. And it's true in cancer, it's true in patients who've had a heart transplant, HIV, psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, muscular dystrophy, and spinal cord injury. And even more striking are these papers. Believe it or not, there's associations between these hope scores and morbidity and mortality. So people with higher hope who have mental illness wind up having fewer psychiatric symptoms. People that have higher hope make a better functional recovery after spinal cord injury, stroke, and surgery. And there's even a literature on hope and survival. So people who are more hopeful actually live longer with cancer and cardiovascular disease. And shown on this slide is something called the Kaplan-Meier survival curve. And it shows the difference between people who are above average on a hope measure and people who were below average in a hope measure in terms of how long they survived. And this is over 500 patients with far advanced malignancies that were participating in clinical trials for other reasons. I can tell you that if we ever found a drug that separated survival curves like that, it would get FDA approved and someone would be charging hundreds of thousands of dollars a year for it. So how does this work? How does hope influence all this stuff? Well, believe it or not, there's biological mechanisms by which hope might work. So if you take healthy volunteers and you put them into a functional MRI machine to see what parts of their brain are active under different conditions, people who are more hopeful have a reduced activity in a part of the brain called the medial orbital frontal cortex, which is involved in stress. Also, we can look at a number of different biomarkers. So in healthy volunteers, folks who are more optimistic, they have different patterns of DNA methylation compared to those who are less hopeful. And that's across multiple different diseases, psychiatric disorders, cardiovascular disorders, cognitive impairment, and cancer. If you look at healthy volunteers, you can also see a relationship between a positive attitude and serological biomarkers of inflammation like C-reactive protein, fibrinogen, triglycerides, and HDL. You can see a relationship between positive attitude and inflammatory cytokines. And in patients with chronic diseases, for example, cancer, you can actually see a relationship between these hope scores and their cortisol slope. People who are more hopeful have a more normal cortisol slope, which we think can blunt inflammation. And people who are more hopeful have lower circulating levels of an inflammatory cytokine called IL-6. If you have a hard time buying that, there might be an even more practical reason for these benefits of hope. So if you look at patients who are healthy or patients with a variety of chronic diseases, those who are higher in hope scores, they engage in more healthy behaviors. So healthy patients who are hopeful are more likely to exercise, control their weight, eat a good diet, engage in stress management, avoid smoking and alcohol. In chronic diseases, people who are more hopeful are the ones who actually adhere to evidence-based treatments. For example, those are the ones that take their medications. So I hope I've convinced you that it's important. If so, then the next question we have to ask is, where does this dispositional hope come from? And again, the best data that we have is in cancer. And I think this was the best paper that I found. It was a meta-analysis of 33 different cancer studies trying to answer this question. And the number one place that it seems to come from is your support network. So your social network, your spiritual and your religious network. And certainly that's what I saw the first time I recognized hope, which was with the Often Awesome Army. Depression seems to be the one comorbidity that pulls hope scores down. Otherwise, there was no relationship, believe it or not, between how old someone was, what sex they were, their level of education, or even the type of disease or the stage of the disease that they were in. None of that seemed to affect hope scores. There seems to be an important role that physicians play in giving patients hope. So again, if we look at the study of 90 patients with chronic illnesses, more than half of which had cancer, they identified sustained and meaningful relationships with healthcare providers as contributing to their hopefulness. And in this study of 32 hospitalized patients with cancer, the number one person they came in contact with that brought them hope was their physician. Now, importantly, just about anybody on the team could bring them hope, but it was the physician more than any other that they thought brought them hope. So what specific things are physicians doing that bring hope? I apologize that this table got a little bit warped, but I think you can still read it. So these are some of the physician behaviors that were associated with increased hope amongst patients with cancer. Taking the time to talk was number one. Giving information, being friendly, polite, showing caring behaviors, being helpful. Just being there, as Ron said in the beginning, being respectful, being honest, being out on the leading edge with regard to research, being genuine, being optimistic, and having a sense of humor, which I thought was great. There's also some physician behaviors and some nurse and system behaviors that can take hope away. So patients with cancer said they got less hopeful if their doctor gave them only discouraging facts, if they presented those facts in a cold, disrespectful way, if there was conflict between two different physicians involved in the care, if they trivialized the patient's situation, or if they communicated poorly. And they identified that nurses who were mean or disrespectful could take away their hope, and so could a system that was cold. So what about specific verbiage that physicians use? Interestingly, there's several studies that suggest that truthful prognostic communication does not lower hope scores. However, surveys suggest that terminally ill patients want a balance of truth and hope. In other words, the concept of let's hope for the best, but at the same time, plan for the worst. And surveys of cancer patients also show that just the mere process of exploration and refocusing of goals related to hope with a physician, that by itself can promote hope. So other important things to remember when it comes to verbiage, there's this great article out there that's entitled Words That Harm, Words That Heal. And it talks about how important it is to avoid frightening metaphors. And certainly I have heard some of my cardiology colleagues use these terms. There's a ticking time bomb in your chest. You have what they call the widowmaker lesion. These are not good terms. And across multiple fields, patients prefer the use of the word if as opposed to when. So in oncology, they would rather hear if you progress, this is what we're going to do, not when you progress, this is what we're going to do. It leaves room for hope. So we understand what physicians should be doing, but this is not going to be easy. So surveys suggest that most doctors are probably not addressing hope in their interactions with patients. Now, why would that be? Well, this absolutely blew my mind when I read it. The latest Harris poll of more than 1,000 doctors suggests that more than 90% of American physicians are now experiencing burnout. And this seems to go up every year. What does burnout do? Well, it robs physicians of their optimism, their empathy, their humor, the exact things that patients said they needed to get hope from their doctor. I also think there's a huge lack of knowledge on this topic. I don't ever remember getting a lecture on hope at any time during my residency or my medical school. And I think because of this lack of knowledge, doctors are afraid that if they bring this up, they might either take away a person's hope if they do it wrong, or they might boost a false hope. And then finally, there's the reality of time pressure. You know, physicians are getting less time than ever before to spend with patients. And at the same time, more of our time is being spent on the things that I call nonsense, including fighting with insurance companies and fighting the institutions that we work for. So if physicians can't do it all, what else is out there? Well, there's a whole lot of what I call hope boosting interventions out there. And they come in all shapes and sizes, but in general, they involve three things: trying to identify goal thoughts, in other words, finding workable goals with the patient, trying to identify pathway thoughts, finding ways to reach those targets, and then finally, agency thoughts, positive self-talk to optimize a person's motivation to accomplish these set goals. And that strategy can be employed through mindfulness-based training, cognitive and behavioral training, and even spiritual retreats. And this is a table that I took from a meta-analysis of 9 trials of different hope interventions in cancer patients. And you can see that there's all different specific names for these, and they range anywhere from a few days to several months. And they can actually be employed by lots of different people, nurses, social workers, lots of different people. It doesn't have to be a physician that leads these. But this meta-analysis concludes that these are effective with medium to large effect sizes. So this is a final question that I had when I was pouring through this literature on health and chronic diseases other than ALS. Does augmenting hope ultimately influence disease? And surprisingly, I found very few studies that address this question. This was one of the best ones. 80 patients with end-stage renal disease who are getting dialysis. It was a randomized controlled trial. So half the patients were randomized to receive this hope-boosting intervention, this 8-session intervention. The others got standard of care. And what they showed was that hope scores significantly improved in the intervention group. Treatment adherence, which in this case included taking medicines, fluid restriction, and diet recommendations, were significantly better in the intervention group. And measures of disease, BUN, phosphate, interdialytic weight, were all significantly better in the intervention group. So boosting hope can actually make a difference on morbidity. So now let's turn our attention to what we know about this topic in ALS. And as I mentioned in the beginning, unfortunately, not nearly as much. This is surprisingly understudied in our field. I mentioned that there were 279 articles on a PubMed search that had hope in ALS in the search terms. Unfortunately, as you can see from some of these ones that I've pasted on here, a lot of these were not actually studying hope. They just had hope in the title or the abstract. And believe it or not, there are far more articles studying hopelessness in ALS than there are studying hope. And that's particularly surprising to me because amongst the studies that are out there, most of them show that hope scores in the majority of people who live with ALS are quite high. And they're not related to disease duration, degree of disability, or stage of the disease. So I cut this table out here because it's pretty easy to understand. They were looking at 16 patients, and they were using a measure of hope that ranged from 1 to 10, where 10 is as much hope as you can possibly imagine. And the average amount of hope in this group was 7.5, which is pretty high. More than half of the people had scores in the 8 to 10 range. And you can see that there's no obvious relationship between how long someone had ALS or how disabled they are. At the bottom there, there's a person that had the disease for 112 months and was dependent upon tracheostomy, and yet had a 10 out of 10 for hope scores. Just like in the literature that we talked about in other chronic diseases, there's evidence that in ALS, a person's specific hopes, they may vary. And one of the nicest articles that I saw that looked into this was by Vitale and Genge. They not only measured the hope index, which was again quite high in their sample, but they did detailed interviews with 13 people with ALS. And their questions included, what does hope mean to you? And some of the answers were hope for family, to be happy or at peace, hope to feel useful, hope to be able to accomplish a short-term goal, like a trip, hope for some stability or improvement, hope to be remembered, hope to go to heaven and see lost relatives, hope for a cure. So I only found one study in the ALS literature that correlated dispositional hope score with the quality of life measurement. And this was by Gallen and colleagues. They looked at 67 consecutive people with ALS who had no cognitive impairment. And they found the same thing that was found in all those other chronic diseases. There's a clear relationship between a hope score and a quality of life or life satisfaction score. There's another study out there that is a more qualitative study, one where they asked 12 people living with ALS about their perceived benefits of hope. And some of the things that patients said: it gives me strength and power. It enables me to retain my spirit, withstand difficulties, depression, and crises. There are frustrations, and you fill yourself with negative energies. You're constantly angry. But once you have hope, you have light. You let the positive energy enter. I didn't find any studies that were looking for a correlation between a hope score and future morbidity or mortality in ALS. Where does it come from? Well, again, similar to what we saw in other chronic diseases, the studies suggest that it comes from social support, but it can also come from getting good scientific information, from spiritual beliefs, from limiting the impact on others, from adapting to changing capacities, from living in the moment, and from transcending the self, from altruism. So Sundhi and Condon synthesized 29 studies of people living with motor neuron disease, mostly people living with ALS, and they had some hope-enabling themes and some hope-suppressing themes that came out of that. Hope-enabling themes: social interactions and support, autonomy, agency, and control, caring and sensitive healthcare providers, and humor. And hope-suppressing themes: isolation, interactions with clinicians that lacked empathy, time, respect, and dignity, problems with informational support, loss of control, agency, or autonomy, and negative emotions. I didn't find any trials attempting to augment hope in people with ALS, but I'll call your attention to that Vitale and Genge study. It showed something very similar to what an earlier study in cancer did, and I think it's fascinating. It looked like just talking about hope with patients could be therapeutic and give them hope. So let me tell you how I synthesize all this, what I conclude, and what I'm now doing about my conclusions. So my first conclusion is we need more hope. We need more research on hope in people living with ALS. We need to know, does it correlate with future adherence, morbidity, and mortality as it does in other fields? Are there specific hope-boosting strategies or programs that can increase hope scores? And do these hope-boosting strategies also improve future adherence, morbidity, and mortality? But in the meantime, I think it's pretty clear that hope is important in people with ALS. It's been shown to help them cope with the disease, and it's associated with better quality of life, which we all agree is something that we want. Specific hopes may be different in different patients. It's important to explore these because it can lead to a form of personalized treatment. And in fact, just talking about these seems to improve hope. Hope comes from a variety of sources in ALS, including members of the healthcare team, especially physicians. And I believe there are specific things that we can do now to boost hope in people with ALS. And so here are some of the things that I'm doing. So first, I recognize that for me to give someone hope, I've got to be resistant to burnout. I've got to be hopeful myself. And I have to say, this is getting more difficult the longer I stay in medicine. I don't know if folks know, but to get one person, one prescription for Radicava or Tofersen, it takes about 100 minutes of clinician time. One prescription, 100 minutes. I'm lucky because I have a great support system of family, friends, and pets. And every night when I lay in bed and I think about the frustrations, I finish the day with a gratitude list, all the things I have in my life that can keep me resilient and hopeful. And one of the things that I have that I've known about since I was a kid that gives me positive energy is my wardrobe. I just find that if I put on something that's bright and colorful, it makes me feel a lot more positive, and I can radiate that off the people I come in contact with. And that unusual mashup of fashion and ALS has taken me to some interesting places. I've been able to meet a designer who had me over to Paris to walk the runway at Men's Fashion Week. I've been able to connect with the tailor for Orville Peck and Post Malone, and together design a suit, which I call my Fashionably Fighting ALS suit, that is covered in symbols of lessons I've learned from people with ALS. I've been able to connect with a tailor in Nashville who was personally touched by ALS. This guy's in the Country Music Hall of Fame because he designed clothes for Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley, Elton John, David Bowie, Frank Sinatra, Lady Gaga. And he made me a jacket that's adorned with the symbols of families that have helped me in my quest to end ALS. And I've even worked with Nomad Customs, who does a lot of the beautiful shoes for the NBA and the NFL, to put together a pair of Fight ALS Air Jordans, which you can see in the bottom picture there. And all those experiences, they boost my optimism and hope. I've gotten my team involved in this because I want to make sure that my team stays optimistic and positive. And so once a month, we've agreed to do something which we call Fashionably Fighting ALS. It's the first Tuesday of each month. The team picks a theme, and we all try to dress in that theme. And this is probably my favorite of all the Fashionably Fighting ALSs. My team picked the theme, dress as your favorite superhero. So I dressed as Doctor Who, and much to my surprise, they all dressed as me. I really try to spend time with my patients and to get to know them and their circle. And so I'm lucky to be in a place where I'm allowed to spend about 2 hours with a new patient and 45 minutes or more with a return. But I'm also lucky that I'm able to spend time outside the clinic with my patients. So I've been all over the world working with patients and families on different types of events. And I think that this helps them to see that I care, but it also helps me to understand them better. It helps me to see what kind of support they have. And it gives me more positive energy that I can give to other patients who need it. And if I had to pick one event that gave me more positive energy than any other, it was watching the young lady in this picture, Andrea Pete, complete her 50th marathon, one in every single state with ALS. I was thrilled to be able to be at the finish line in Prince of Wales Island, Alaska, to give her a high five. I've thought a lot about the words that I choose, and I try to be very careful. I try to remember, if not when, hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And I'll give you an example of why I think this is not being done in a lot of places. I've had a lot of patients who've left another clinic and come to me and said the way they were told about ALS is an example number one. You have 2 to 3 years to live. You need to get your affairs in order. So here's another way to break the news. The disease can be disabling and life-shortening, but it doesn't have to define you. There's a lot of variability in how people do with it. 10% of people with this disease live 10 years or more. There's rare examples of people who lived 50 years, and even a small number of people who recovered from it. Only time is going to tell how you are going to do. But I can promise you, we're going to be with you all the way through. Every visit, my team and I see you. We will do what we can to slow your disease down and make your life as good as it can be. And if there are changes from one visit to the next, we will always have new things that we can offer you. I've started to ask patients in my clinic to tell me about 3 things that they're hopeful for based upon that study that I told you about that Angela Genge did. And the answers are similar to what she saw. They're very different in different people. These are some of the things that some of my recent patients have said they're hopeful about, that I'll be able to find solutions to increase my mobility, that some of my measurements will stabilize or improve, that I'll be able to find more experimental options to try, that I'll be able to improve my strength, that I'll have some options to relieve the stress on my spouse, that I'll continue to have my army of friends, that I'll be able to find a cure, that Dr. B will outdo his last outfit. And so again, to me, if I understand this, this can lead to a much more personalized approach to treatment. And I'll give you some examples. So to address this one, I'm hopeful that some of my measurements will stabilize or improve. Well, unfortunately, there are some things that we have to measure in clinic that are likely to get worse from time to time. The ALS FRSR, the forced vital capacity, and strength. The reason that we have to measure these is they help us to decide when to offer different specific options, and also because insurance companies often require these measurements to be documented in order to determine coverage for different options. Now, we can see plateaus and even improvements in some of these measurements, as you see in the ALS FRSR score in this one patient who was in a research study over 600 days. That clearly isn't a straight line progression. But again, unfortunately, many times these measurements are going to be worse, and I could see how that could affect a person's hope. Well, what if we tried to incorporate measurements into our clinic that were likely to be stable or could even improve over time? And I was having a conversation about this one time with this brilliant PA that I worked with, Kelly White. And she said, oh yeah, of course. I always check everyone's vibrioception. I take a tuning fork and I put it on their knees and I say, you see, this disease is not affecting a lot of parts of your nervous system. I think that's brilliant. And I'm also a huge fan of Dr. Plews Ogan. They've thought a lot about hope. And one of the things that I love that they've invented is called the ALS Turbocharged Living Scale. So this is a questionnaire that we can give to patients, and it asks them to describe how well they're doing on different aspects of their person that don't have to be touched by ALS, like humor, kindness, compassion, resilience, altruism. And so simply by measuring this, I suspect that we're making patients more hopeful, and we're giving them pathways they can use to improve their lives. What about those folks who say, I just hope to feel useful? Well, that gives me a reminder to try to connect them to research studies. And there are examples of studies out there that now almost anyone with ALS can participate in, no matter what stage of the disease they're in. The National ALS Registry, the ALS TDI, ALS Research Collaborative, the CREATE PGB study, the NIH All ALS study, which is coming. I also think that this is a perfect group of patients to talk about advocacy too. And so there's a lot of ways for patients to get involved in advocacy to make them feel more useful. I Am ALS has a lot of action committees on their website that you can join. And I've created something called the ALS Clinical Research Learning Institute. It's a training program for people living with ALS who want to be even more powerful research advocates. And so we teach you the language of research, and we show you where there's pressure points that you can help us push on to make research more efficient. And that's a picture from one of our graduating classes. And I do want to remind folks that nominations for the next in-person Clinical Research Learning Institute, which will be this fall in Clearwater, Florida, are now being accepted. And you can find details at that link right there or on the NEALS website. And it turns out that patients who participate in advocacy are making a huge difference in our field. They've changed funding. They've changed laws, which have created more research opportunities. They've empowered researchers like me and companies to create more attractive and patient-centric studies. They've heightened awareness of ongoing research options. They've increased regulatory flexibility in drug approvals. They're pressuring payers to cover some of these new FDA-approved therapies. And they're educating other patients, clinicians, and researchers. And I really do feel like, as a community, we're better together. What about this one? Hope to try experimental products. It's a pretty common one. And so when I get this, the first thing I try to do is find that patient a clinical trial. And the good news is there's more trials recruiting now than there's ever been. There's more than 90 clinical trials on this website that are looking for patient participants. Now, unfortunately, that's still not going to be nearly enough for every person out there living with ALS. And a lot of these trials are pretty restrictive. So if I can't find a trial for that patient, the next thing I look for is an expanded access program. Again, it's a great opportunity to get a product that we know a lot about, where there's a lot of oversight for safety and where we can actually learn something from the patient's participation. But there's still not nearly enough of these. And so most of my patients wind up doing something which I call self-experimentation. They want to buy and try products. And the good news is I've created a program called ALSUntangled. It's kind of like the X-Files of ALS. It will review any idea that a person with ALS has, publish those reviews on a website, and allow patients and families and clinicians to make more informed decisions about which of these products might make most sense to self-experiment with. Hope givers don't just have to be physicians on a multidisciplinary team. I don't think that my exact approach is going to work for everyone. But based on my literature review, I think every ALS clinic should now identify at least one person on the team who's going to be what Jody O'Donnell Ames calls a hope giver. This person has to have the right attitude. They have to have the right bedside manner. They have to have the time to spend with the patient. And what they should be doing is assessing the specific things that each person is hopeful about and what resources they have for achieving those. And once we know what those things are, that person should alert the rest of the team about places where we can go, things we can do to help this patient realize those specific hopes. And if there's one that we can't help with, then we should be referring patients to those hope boosting programs that are out there. Some other things that I'm working on. I've been incredibly impressed with some of the movies that are out there about ALS, Gleason, Go On, Be Brave, No Ordinary Campaign, just to name a few. I think that these really can inspire a lot of hope. And I want to put my story out there about how I'm staying positive and hopeful, and why I think it's important to try to bring hope to people with ALS. And so hopefully next year you'll be able to watch a documentary short called Stitching Strength that sort of highlights my use of creativity and fashion to do this. And I'm also now writing a protocol. I think it's time to do a trial of a hope boosting intervention and see what does this actually do in people with ALS as far as their hope scores, their adherence to evidence-based treatments, their quality of life, their ALS FRSR progression, and their survival. So I'll leave you with just two thoughts. There are consequences to not providing hope to patients and families. First, patients are being denied those benefits that we've talked about today. And in ALS, that's clearly quality of life. And it might actually be morbidity and mortality too, if we believe that the literature in other chronic diseases will generalize. By not providing hope, you're also driving patients to sources where the information that they're getting may not be as reliable, like the internet. And so there are literally tens of thousands of websites advertising treatments that are effective and safe for ALS. Most of these have no science behind them, and that would be bad enough, except we do see that patients who pursue a lot of these alternative and off-label therapies are being harmed financially, physically, and psychiatrically. The other consequence of not providing hope in your clinic is that those of us who do provide it, we're getting overwhelmed. Like, I literally can't keep up with the number of emails and calls and referrals, at least half of which are from patients from other clinics who want to come because they don't feel like they're getting hope in their clinic. That's not ideal for those patients, because if you're traveling across the world to see me, and you need things, it's very difficult for me to figure out, how do I get a BiPAP machine in India, or get you a medicine for pseudobulbar affect in Argentina? Who's the best home care group or hospice group for people with ALS, in rural Nevada? I mean, these are things that local clinics would know a lot more about than I do. So if we all did this, patients wouldn't have to travel. And I'll just leave you with this quote. It's one of my favorites. I heard it years ago, and believe it or not, I can't remember who said it. I couldn't find it on the internet anywhere. If you know who said this, please let me know. But I think this quote perfectly captures my attitude about why I need to stay hopeful, and about why hope is so important for patients and families living with ALS. Carry a light, and you need not fear the darkness. So thank you, and I'll be happy to answer some questions now.
Thank you, Rick. We have a number of comments in the chat. I'll go ahead and go through those first so we can see if there's anything that you can directly address here. Let's see. Lindsay says, thank goodness we can't sell hope. Probably be pretty expensive. She also says, insurance companies are hope killers. Honestly, they cause more harm, in my opinion. Would you have a response to that, Rick?
So I would say it's one of several problems that we have in healthcare right now that's trying to drain all of our hopes. There's just far too many people interested in money in healthcare. I mean, I think the problem actually starts with the pharmaceutical companies who are developing therapies. As a community, we work really hard to partner with them, to help them, design studies that work, to help them recruit, to help them craft their language, to stand up in front of the FDA and fight to get these therapies approved. And then, they turn around and they price their drugs at least 10 times higher than there's any justification for. That's the first problem. Second problem is you've got insurance companies that then look at the price of these drugs and what they do, and they say, oh, we can't afford to pay for those. And so some of these companies just flat out call some of the new FDA approved therapies experimental. Like, we've got some companies calling Radicava and Tofersen experimental, just refusing to pay. Most of them require a lengthy battle, again, 100 minutes of effort to finally get things for patients. And what's especially frustrating about all that is if you look at the bottom line of a lot of these insurance companies, like, for example, Cigna, which is one of the ones that calls all these therapies experimental, they made double-digit billions of dollars in profit last year. Their CEO got a massive bonus. All that CEO had to do is cut his bonus down, and they could have paid for all these ALS medicines and all these patients. So it's incredibly aggravating. It's incredibly frustrating. But I feel like there isn't going to be a quick answer to this. I kind of feel like it's sort of like what we're trying to do to find the cure for ALS. We've got to just keep chipping away at it. But there's strength in numbers. And so I feel like social media now is a powerful tool that patients and families can use. We need to embarrass these companies, these pharmaceutical companies and these insurance companies. This behavior is outrageous. And if that doesn't work, then we need to use our connections in Congress to pass laws that make them behave, because they're ruining the entire system. I understand that you're struggling with them, and we are too. And I'm just afraid of what medicine's going to look like in 10 years if 93% of physicians across all specialties are currently experiencing burnout. I mean, what does that mean? I mean, people are probably going to start leaving in droves, and then what? So, I mean, I think we got to keep chipping away at this. It's got to be an advocacy priority.
Yeah. Ron, did you have a comment on that? No, not right now. Okay, I thought I saw you indicating you had a thought to share.
Yeah, I completely concur with what Richard just said. Go ahead, James.
Okay, cool. Here's somebody who is working with you. Brian has been part of a clinical study on the genetic mutation, and he feels like there's some hope there with drugs that are being developed to address the genetic expression of ALS. Do you have a thought on that, Dr. Bedlack?
Yeah. So, I mean, if I had to pick one thing that I've seen, that I'm confident is the biggest breakthrough that we've ever had in the history of ALS, it's the drug tofersen. Now, I am on the DSMB for Biogen's development of this product. Just wanted to disclose that right off the top. But I mean, this is a drug that targets the most well understood cause of the disease. We understand exactly how mutations in the SOD1 gene cause ALS, and therefore we understand exactly what we need to do to block it. We need to reduce the amount of that mutant protein as much as we can. And so that's exactly what this drug tofersen does. It binds to the RNA and it reduces the expression of the mutant protein. And so there was a lot of debate about whether there was enough data to approve this when it went up in front of the FDA. I think it was early last year. And thankfully they did approve it, because if you saw Dr. Chikovitz's presentation from December at the International Symposium on Motor Neuron Disease, she showed data from people that have been on this drug now for, in some cases, up to 2 years. About half of them have stopped progressing, and about 20% are recovering lost motor function. That's extraordinary. I think that more than half of the people researching ALS did not think that was possible with any drug. Clearly, if we can understand the right target and hit it, we can stop or reverse ALS. And so I just feel like that was such a breakthrough, not only for the 1% to 2% of patients who have that form of ALS, but for all of us to be able to see what's possible.
Yeah, for sure. Brandy is saying, hope doesn't mean denial. That's my motto.
I completely agree. Yeah, and I think that one of the most important studies that I mentioned along those lines is that one in cancer, where patients actually wanted their doctor to be honest with them about the disease and about the prognosis, but they also wanted to leave some room for hope. There's always variability in the prognosis of every disease. I don't know of any disease where you can say with 100% certainty this is exactly what's going to happen. And so I think that quote about if not when, and that quote about let's hope for the best, but at the same time, let's make sure that we prepare for the worst just in case that happens. I think that's a great strategy for people to adapt.
Yeah. Good. We have a comment here, a question from Bill. Can you share the ALS turbocharged living scale tool?
Yeah, I wonder if Dr. Plews Ogan is actually on here with us, but it came from his blog. If he's not on, then I think I actually put the reference to his blog there, but I can also email it, Ron, to you and to James if you want to distribute it.
And we'll send it out to everybody.
Yeah.
I had that written down as well. It's well done.
Yeah.
Very well done.
Okay, good. Well, so you can plan on getting that from us here in the near future. In the meantime, we've got Peter who's raised his hand. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Peter.
And they're not raised by hand.
No, that's a different Peter, Peter Quinn. It was someone else.
Oh. Yeah.
Peter Trujillo. Sorry. Good to see you.
And James, Peter stepped away, so continue on, please.
Okay. Let's see. So Mary Ellen is wondering, how do you start a conversation with someone who is depressed, and avoidant of discussion?
Yeah, so that also brings us back to that study that we saw in the cancer literature, that's one of the things that really pulls down hope scores. So I really feel like before you can get to addressing the hope, you've got to address the depression. And the good news is that is modifiable. So there's medications and there's therapy, through psychologists and psychiatrists that we know can help people with depression. And so once the depression starts to lift, then I think it's time to dive into the conversations about specifically what are you hopeful for and how can we help you realize some of these hopes that you have.
Peter Trujillo, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, I messed up there, but can you hear me
Go
now?
ahead, Peter. Yeah, go.
Dr. Bedlack, a few years ago, you had a video about we may be flushing the cure for ALS down the toilet. I talked about the gut-brain axis. I want to know where that was at, what you ever derived from that, and then also your study with Genius in I think Australia.
Yeah.
I know you're doing a trial with that, so we're curious about that.
Yeah.
Any results?
Yeah, good memory about the cure for ALS being flushed down our toilets. I kind of like that title. Yeah, so I'll say the microbiome field has gotten even more exciting. So at Duke, in partnership with Augie's Quest and Martha Olson Fernandez Foundation, we were able to put together a study where we looked at the composition of the gut microbiome in slow and fast progressing patients from my clinic. And it's different. Now, the complicating thing is it's not different in one simple way. And so we're still trying to sort out what combination of organisms is the key one. But this is what we do know. If we take the stool samples from a person with either slow or fast progressing ALS and we put it into the genetic mouse model of ALS, we can change the progression rate. So there is something in those stool samples that can change the progression rate of ALS. So as we have over the past year, done more experiments to try to figure out which organism and use that to try to design a probiotic, there also has been now 3 cases published in the literature of people with ALS who got fecal transplants. So fecal transplants means you take the stool of a person without ALS that's been screened carefully to make sure there's no way it could cause disease, and you put it into the colon of the person with ALS. And these 3 cases have shown a pretty dramatic slowing in the progression of ALS. Now, 3 case reports is not proof that it works, but to me, putting all this together, I've shifted gears a little bit, and the Microbiome Center at Duke tries to help me figure out what direction to go in with the probiotic. I've now contacted the Duke Fecal Transplant Center, and we're trying to put together a protocol to do a trial of fecal transplants in people with ALS. So that's where we are with that. And then you asked about the study that we're doing with Genius. That study is a part of our ROAR DIGAP program. ROAR stands for Replication of ALS Reversals. And it's a program that does small pilot trials looking at some of the specific products that people who recovered from ALS took. Most of these are vitamins and supplements. So this trial program is looking for people to recover from ALS. And when you set the bar that high, there's a few things to remember. 1, it's a long shot that we'll be able to do that. But 2, you can be a lot less stringent with who participates. So we can have very wide inclusion criteria. We don't need placebos in these kinds of trials. If someone who couldn't walk can walk at the end of one of my trials, it's not a placebo effect. You don't even need a lot of in-person visits. You can measure a lot of the things we need to measure over the phone or by video. And so we've done some of these ROAR trials so far. None of the products that we tested reversed ALS. But now we're thinking maybe it's too simple to think that there's one product that reverses everyone's ALS. Because the biology of ALS is probably different in different individuals, maybe we need to match people, match their biology to a product associated with the reversal that hits that biology. So Genius, this Australian company, thinks they may have a technology that can do this. It's called DIGAP, Deep Integrated Genomics Analysis Platform. It basically looks at a person's entire genome. So not just whether they have an ALS-causing genetic mutation or not, but everything, every single genetic abnormality that they have. And it plugs it all into a machine learning, artificial intelligence program that puts it all together and says, based on everything we see here, this is the chemical pathway that is most likely killing motor neurons in this person. And we're going to use that information to match them to a supplement. Again, a supplement that's associated with the reversal that hits that pathway. So we will be enrolling our first patients in that study this week. It's been about a 2-year odyssey to get that open, but we finally started enrolling patients at Duke and Temple this week.
Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. Letitia is enjoying the message. She says yes to hope. Lisa's wondering if there are studies being done on sporadic ALS with frontal temporal dementia.
Yeah, so the answer is yes. Those are more difficult things to do clinical trials on, that particular topic, because a lot of times when we're exposing somebody to a product that could cause harm, there's a desire to make sure that the person that we're doing this to knows what they're getting into. So I think that there's always been, some consternation about enrolling people who are not cognitively intact in clinical trials. It is possible to do, but it is much more difficult. But yes, there are studies. There certainly are studies being done on genetics, biomarkers, neuropathology, those kinds of things.
Thank you. Brian is saying Dr. Bedlack is one of the only people in the entire ALS community who gave me hope. We need to get him more staff and more funding.
Well, I so appreciate you saying that. But it also frustrates me because this is not that complicated. Like, we need to make this a priority. And I hope by putting this out there, by putting the movie out there, by doing that clinical trial and hopefully showing that hope actually does matter as far as outcomes that everyone believes in, that we'll get more people to do it. Ultimately, we may need to ask some of the people that fund clinics, is there a hope giver in the clinic? You don't get funding if you don't have certain people on your staff. Who's the hope giver in each clinic, and what are they actually doing to understand and promote hope? I think it should be a required part of every multidisciplinary clinic.
Mhm. Yeah, I want to speak to that. Imagine if we could prescribe a pill for hope. Okay. Another word that I work with hope is faith. The importance of having hope, the importance of having faith. The biggest challenge, I believe, that all of you living with the uninvited guest known as ALS, the individuals living with ALS and those who are tending to and caring for, the challenge is, how do we learn to live life differently? And if we can touch into that magic word hope, to that magic word faith in something, the belief in something more than what we are, whether it's a religious belief or a belief in nature or the ability to explore all the possibilities. Because obviously what everyone is faced with is mortality, and that's the white elephant in the room. That's what I believe gets in the way of good doctoring, good medicine. Because oftentimes most of our physicians haven't taken the time and maybe don't have the know-how to explore their own mortality. That's what's lacking, in my opinion. So the importance of hope, the importance of faith, being able to explore what's possible. And again, if there was a magic pill for all that, it would be a wonderful thing. What I'm most proud about our organization is, honestly, that's what we bring. For those of you who don't know us, I invite you to explore. Go to our website, go to our resources, go to our educational library. I couldn't do this work if I didn't have hope, if I didn't have faith, and if I didn't meet folks like Dr. Bedlack. All right. And, fortunately, our healthcare system, our physicians, more and more are following the path and the example that Dr. Bedlack leads. And that's what we need. And I invite everyone, hold your physicians accountable. You do that by asking questions. And I would invite everyone, when you go to clinic, please take someone else with you. We all need another set of ears to hear what we're hearing and to express what it is that you're wanting to share and the questions that you ask. So go ahead, James.
Thank you, Ron. Peter Trujillo, you had another question. Did you want to unmute?
Yes. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the most recent stuff that I saw about you, you were talking about IGF BP7 and TDP43. I've asked those questions of our personal neurologist here in Tucson, and her answer to me just this past week was, oh, these are all theoretical things that we don't really pursue. So we are running into that exact problem that you're talking about. She's not like giving any kind of hope. It seems like I'm the one giving her direction about that. So I want to find out where you were with that IGFBP 47, and then my son Derek is the one with ALS. We were considering starting him with the CNM AU8. I didn't know what your thoughts were on that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. So yes, we did find an interesting genetic abnormality in ALS reversals. I have to keep it on the down low for the next few weeks because we've had our finding accepted to be published in a prestigious journal that has something called an embargo policy. It's not my policy, but I do want this to get published in the best possible journal so the most possible people can see it. It should be coming out in publication, hopefully in the next 2 to 3 weeks. And so once it's out, I'll share it. I'll put it on Instagram. I'll be happy to give a presentation just about that particular thing and what we're doing to follow it up. But for right now, I can't say too much more about it other than what I've already said. And we'll also know more at the end of next month. We have a follow-up study underway, and that's with our partners at ALS TDI. And when that's finished, which we hope will be the end of July, we'll know more about whether that is a new target that is worth pursuing in a clinical trial. So.
Thank you. Erin has raised her hand. Erin, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hi. I was just wondering, there's a few of us who have been asking the same question about the C9 gene. And just if, with that mutation, and I had reached out to Dr. Agar. I don't know if you know him at Northeastern, but he was saying that there is a lot of research, and I was wondering if if there's any hope with the C9 gene.
I would say there's tons of hope. So again, I point to that Toferson study and I say, once we understood how SOD1 caused ALS, it didn't take us really all that long to find a way to address that mechanism and find what I think is the most effective therapy that we've ever found in the history of ALS. Unfortunately, it only works in that 1 to 2%. But I think we're honing in on how exactly hexanucleotide repeats in the C9 ORF72 gene cause ALS. I think it's only a matter of time before we figure out exactly how that happens. There's so many smart people working on that. In fact, I would say there's more people working on that particular genetic abnormality than any other one. And once we understand how it's happening, we will find a way to overcome that. And we will be able to do, I believe, as well as we're doing with Toferson for people with that mutation.
Thank you. Diane is saying, excellent presentation. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack and Ron, for your dedication and for your hope. We're a little bit, we're 10 minutes past our time here. We've got about 21 more questions left, but I think in the interest of time, we probably ought to close out for today and then try to follow up with the answers as best as we can. How do you feel, Dr. Bedlack? I think you're about ready to wrap it up.
That sounds good to me, James. I appreciate everyone's interest, and I know it's a nice day in a lot of places, beautiful day out here. So appreciate everyone coming inside and watching a Zoom talk on a Sunday.
For sure.
And two things. One, Dr. Bedlack mentioned the ambassador program. And I see a lot of folks that we work with on at CCALS. I would encourage you to look into that. It's really special, and it truly, truly matters. If you guys have any questions, folks that I know, feel free to reach out to me. But I'll invite you to explore that. And Dr. Bedlack mentioned earlier gut, the research that's being going on in our gut, in our stomach. I can't, and I'm a layperson, I'm not a clinician, but I know there's a whole lot relevant to what the intake that we have. On a personal note, I recently had to go gluten-free. I love bread. All right. But I truly had to, and I saw how hard it was, but I've acclimated myself to it. But I have arthritis in my hands, incredible inflammation. I haven't had wheat in a month, and I have no inflammation in my hands. What can I say? Again, the whole gut piece is something incredibly important to look into. Nurse practitioner, my friend, has been talking to me, Dr. Bedlack, about what you talked about fecal implants a year and a half ago. And so there's a whole lot going on here. So I appreciate everyone showing up here. Richard, thank you as always. Love your work. Love your work. I love your ways. Okay.
I feel the
And,
same way about you, Ron.
Yeah. I mean, there's such wonderful commonality here. And you bring both the clinical and the heart and compassion component, which more of our physicians in the world need to bring forth. So thank you, James.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Bedlack. Just keep the hope cooking. You know, as we saw today, it really does make a difference. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.